Hello everyone, welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California, a section of the world that is currently on fire. I walked outside this morning and I was like, why does the wind taste like barbecue? Oh right, because basically this side of the country is immolating on a constant and daily basis. Great little world we've created for ourselves. Hey, I don't mean to start out every introduction with a recitation of the living nightmare that's going on, but when I uncork my brain, that's just where it goes. Which, hey, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, I guess strap in. This is a great episode. This was I would call it an honor. Because on today's episode, I talked to Shirley Collins. If you don't know who she is, let me read you her bio. Shirley Collins, MBE. By the way, yes, that's for non-British folks. That's member of the most excellent order of the British Empire. Shirley Collins, MBE, is an English folk singer, song collector, and perhaps the greatest living embodiment of the musical threads that connect the country with its history. In 1959, she assisted Alan Lomax on his famous folk song collecting trip in the southern U.S., and as a significant presence during the Second English Folk Revival in the 1960s, Shirley formed a duo with her sister Dolly, who accompanied Shirley's raw and direct voice on piano and portative organ. Together they recorded the startling Anthems in Eden and Love, Death, and the Lady. After almost 4 decades of silence, though, Shirley started recording and releasing material again, starting with 2016's Lodestar and her latest Heart's Ease, which was just released on Domino in July and is just absolutely lovely. And for the entire 10 plus years of this show, I have either done these talks in person, mostly up until the pandemic, and then by Zoom. And I always pushed to do these talks in person because I think there's a nuance and an energy in the room when you're talking to someone about these kinds of topics, childhood and creativity, that doesn't get captured otherwise. And then I start to do them on Zoom, and yeah, the energy's not the same, but also I get to talk to people in other countries and other states, and I think that made up for it. And then I was like, well, I still gotta see the person, right? And then Shirley comes along, and she uses Zoom, but not with a video camera. Her computer doesn't have a video camera. And I'm like, all right, you know what? For Shirley, let's try this over the phone. And we had a great conversation. So either I'm just fantastic at interviewing people, or phone conversations around certain topics still can be very fruitful and interesting. We get into so much. I mean, I won't spoil anything, but Shirley was born in 1935, right on the cusp of World War II. And so, that really, growing up during a giant global conflagration, affects you as a person. So we start out there and branch out into every other corner of her life. And she's just a wonderful creative person, wonderful human. You'll hear. I don't have to tell you this. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you want to listen to other episodes, they're all up on Spotify or on the other platforms. The last 100 episodes are up. You can also just download the MP3s at beginnings.libsyn.com. But like I said, I've been doing this show for 10 years, so I've done hundreds of interviews with TV writers and actors and comedians and musicians and artists and thinkers. So I don't know if you're here because you like Shirley's music, You might like, I did a great talk with Colin Newman of Wire. I did a great talk with Dean Wareham from Luna and Galaxy 500. Mitski. I don't know. Too many people to really think about. I don't know if you're here just because you like British people. I've talked to Will Sharp, who's the creator of Flowers, and he's an actor in a wonderful show called Giri Haji. Aisling B., Maeve Higgins, Josie Long. So check out those episodes. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google, wherever really you get podcasts from. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Andy Beckerman. And coming up, some fantastic episodes. Hey, speaking of people from the UK, Cy Spurrier, one of my favorite comics writers, he's on the show soon. Talking about folk music. Diane Cluck, I talked to her about a lot of great stuff. Owen Pallett from Arcade Fire and Final Fantasy, and a bunch of other cool talks. Stay tuned. Awesome stuff coming up. But for now, let's talk to Shirley. When I was reading about your childhood on the internet last night, there were like 20 different things that like popped out to me. I guess the first one, I'm really curious. You were born right as World War II was dawning.
Yes, I was born in 1935, so that would just be about 4 years before. Yes,
and I'm curious, obviously you were a child during that time, but do you feel any kind of resonances with the current era?
That's a tricky question. I don't know about that. No, I don't honestly think so, because my childhood is so utterly different from anyone's these days. I know we're in sort of really dangerous situations all over the world now and at home as well. But no, I guess it was, my childhood seemed very straightforward in many ways, partly because of the family I was born in, I think, and the fact that, we were taken away from the family twice, my sister and I. We were evacuated during the war when we were quite little children, sent away because of the bombing raids on the town of Hastings where I was born. And yet I don't have any memory of that at all, except for getting on a train at Hastings railway station and going over a huge viaduct, or it seemed to me like a great big viaduct when I was that age. And that's the only memory I have. But I've got one photograph of my sister and me taken in Welling Garden City, the place we were sent to. And that's a picture of us in the schoolyard with our Wellington boots on, holding Dolly's arm around my shoulder, very protective, to be sent home. But I can't remember anything else, except that the house that we stayed in had steps that instead of going straight forward out of the front door, they turned sideways and went down sideways. And that's all I can remember.
There's something about shapes when you're a child. I don't know what it is, but the things that stick out to me a lot are just the things are, I want to say like architecturally strange, but I don't even know if I mean that. I just mean that like there are certain, like, I don't know if you want to call them Proustian, but like those little things that stick in your head that bring you back to those moments, that when I see like certain odd shaped things, I'm reminded of the house I grew up in.
That's nice. I'm trying to see if I've got any memory like that myself, but I can't dredge one up.
But so you're evacuated. So, that was the other big thing that I thought about, that you grew up in Hastings, like the place where the Norman conquest kicked off, the place where maybe modern Western society started in some way. And I'm curious if like growing up there, if you felt that history, if that history was transmitted to you in any way, if there was any kind of feeling about that history in the air. It's tough in America, everything here that's modern is built in the last couple hundred years. But when I talk to people who are from Europe or who are from any other part of the world, really, the history of the places they're from go back 1,000 or more years. And I'm curious if you felt that when you were a child at all.
Well, yes, I did. I was very well aware. I mean, I always loved history lessons at school. I still love old churches, Saxon churches, some that go back before the Conqueror built his Norman castles in Hastings. The age of things is really important to me, which is why I know I could never live in a newer country like the States or Australia, because there wouldn't be that age of buildings that I just love so much. To walk into a little country church that's been there for, well, since the 11th century is just wonderful to me. It's the best atmosphere, and what I always take from it, is how many thousands of people were there before me as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm lucky in Lewis, where I live now. I can see the castle just around the corner from. We've got another castle here at Lewis that was built in 11 something. So, yeah, age of buildings especially is quite crucial to me, really.
There's also, could you feel, there's sometimes when I go to places that have that history, I feel that the residue in some way, like I feel it in my body. I don't know a better way to explain it than that. Than like last summer, my wife and I went to Amsterdam with her mom and her mom's husband for their anniversary. And just walking around, it just like, even though, there's, an old building and it now houses a Starbucks, that building, goes back, 1,000 years or something like that. And you could kind of feel that in your body there. Or at least I could.
Yeah, no, I think that's wonderful that you're the sort of person that can let that in, because a lot of people just wouldn't give that a thought. But, history is just so central to us, at least, I mean, to me. No, you're obviously, I mean, sorry, I don't want to flatter you. I'm not trying to flatter you, but you have to be, a sensitive person to pick up these feelings about places. And God knows there's so much history there, and so many people have pressed into it as well. That there's got to be some residue of all that still, even in these modern times.
Yeah, well, I mean,
in coffee.
That's what I was thinking about, when I talk to people on the show, especially I would say musicians, I feel like, well, okay, you know what, I'm generalizing. Maybe I should. Let me just ask you, are you that kind of sensitive person? Did you grow up, there's both the historical time period you grew up in, and also I would say a English stereotype of being reserved or, not letting your emotions out. Do you think you're a person who maybe does now or did when you were a child? Were you emotional? Were you reserved? What kind of person were you when you were growing up?
I think the English generally, although this is just a generalization because everything is so cosmopolitan now, and we have influences from all over the world. But yes, there is a sort of reservation in the English, but it's not cold. And some people think of the English as cold. And again, you can't generalize, because who are the English? There are so many variants of English. But I know that my family was not reserved, but just they didn't show off, they didn't make a noise. They just lived quietly and amicably on the whole. And I mean, what I find about people generally nowadays is that it's just so noisy. They show off all the time. There's so much self-adulation. I can't bear it. I mean, and people who are, just not worthy of notice seem to grab an awful lot of attention. But the family I grew up in, so we were people who lived very close to the countryside, and we were always out walking in the country, my sister and I, as children, when we were back home in Hastings. We spent our time in the countryside. We spent our time reading books and looking for birds' nests and simple things, reading in bed at night with a torch under the covers that we weren't supposed to have, and just simple things, because we were very poor as well. There was no money around ever. My dad was a milk roundsman from a local farm before he joined the army and went off to fight. The thing is, though, that I always appreciated what my family had. I mean, I had two uncles who were artists. Another uncle, Fred Ball, who wrote two novels and was the biographer of Robert Tressel, the author of the first working class novel, the Ragged Trousered Philanthropists. So that I knew there was worth in the people I knew in my family. And my granddad were just the loveliest people you could meet. Granddad was a gardener, and Granny at that time was the housewife, but a gentle and funny and lovely woman that you could trust absolutely implicitly, and who would always look after you. She had a jar of mint humbugs that if you fell over and grazed your knee on the pavement outside, you just rushed into Granny and she'd give you a sweet to eat and you'd be okay again. So no, I know the value and the worth of people, but yeah, and we weren't noisy. Let's put it.
Well, there is some. I mean, there was a huge cultural shift in the way that we, at least I'll say in the West, I really can't speak for other cultures, but like that the way we regard ourselves, we sometime in the, do you ever watch Adam Curtis's documentaries?
No.
He's great. He's wonderful. He's a British documentarian, and he creates these wonderful documentaries about how we've changed over the 20th century into the 21st century. And a lot of his the thrust of his documentaries is talking about how we've gone inward, how we've gone, instead of engaging with the world around us, he says that we have that the world has gotten so complex and difficult to deal with that instead of doing that, we just go inward. And so I think part of the shift to being online all the time and talking about yourself is part of that, as opposed to, finding simple pleasures within the world. You're now sitting in your house on Instagram talking about the food you ate, as opposed to walking around finding birds' nests.
We wouldn't damage the birds' nests, by the way. We just looked at them. But funnily enough, with this introspection, though, Andy, comes an awful lot of conceit as well. Yes, we're sort of focusing on ourselves more. And I mean, in many ways, people are kinder now, perhaps. Although it's so difficult to say, because everything is changing so rapidly now. What with the coronavirus and the politics that are going on in both your country and mine, life is bewildering and speedily changing.
Mm.
And don't really...
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I don't really like people at the moment, a lot of them, because you get so many people on Facebook, and of course I do Facebook, but they're just willing to argue every single point or just make a nasty remark about something. And I fear for people now, because I live in a beautiful little street of Victorian cottages, red brick cottages, and they're lovely little places. And we all grow flowers outside our front doors, so that there's hardly any pavement left to walk on. It's a narrow street. We have trees on one side and two meadows and the most beautiful skyline. And what do I see almost all day long? People just walking along, heads down, looking at their phones.
Mm-hmm.
And it breaks my heart for them. I just long to say to them, look up, look out, just see what's there. And they don't notice, and it breaks my heart. What
Yeah.
are they going to be like, if they're not aware of anything except this little block of plastic in front of them?
I think for a lot of people, the world has become too heartbreaking to deal with. And so it's much easier to, sit and look at pictures of your friends on Instagram than it is to engage with my wife and I live in Los Angeles, in an area. We moved in about a year, a little over like a year and a couple months ago. And in that time, there was already a terrible homelessness problem here in this area. And in the last year and a couple months, it's exploded. And I think that is, as the 21st century has grinded on, I think things may have become more depressing for a lot of people. And so they find some kind of refuge in their phones.
Well, I'd rather find refuge in a sunset
Yes.
or a meadow. That wouldn't console me at all.
Yes, I agree. But so the other thing though that I was thinking about when you were talking, was making art, the way I think a lot of times it's regarded now, it's people enter into making art as a career in a very business-like way. And I'm curious, you had family members who were writers. How did you understand making art when you were young?
Well, I mean, the thing is, the two uncles who were painters made a living as painters, but Uncle Fred, who was the biographer of Robert Dressel, had a job during the day as well. He was a gas meter collector. He went around collecting the money from the gas meters in Hastings, and that was his job. I mean, nobody quite broke away from this working class background, but Mum always was always insistent that we read a lot, which Dolly and I love to do anyway. So we were quite aware of reading and listening to music, but we only had a wind-up gramophone, and we only had, I think, 2 or 3 discs. And one of them was a dreadful thing called The Laughing Policeman. The other one was in a bandolier group, music as well. And that was all we had, except we had the radio, or the wireless as we called it in those days. And from that, you could listen to all the great classics as well as all the pop stuff you wanted. Mum didn't approve of pop music, though. She was convinced that it would corrupt us if we listened to too much. So we used to have to listen to that when Mum was out. So I was aware of the great composers, and Uncle Fred loved music as well, and he would play us on his much better gramophone, Monteverdi and other Italian Renaissance composers. And that was the music that I really loved best at that time. And we listened to English composers like Vaughan Williams and George Butterworth. So I was familiar with that. And all that sounded just perfect to me. It was just what I wanted. But then, because Granny and Grandad had sung to my sister and me during the war when we were at home, and they lived 2 doors away from us in Hastings, and we'd go in their house at nights if there were bombing raids to sleep in their shelter, which was a big iron table with mesh sides that you threw your mattress in and your pillows, and slept there during the air raids. And Granny and Grandad sang to us, and what they sang was, Grandad sang what I later learned were folk songs. And Granny sang a lot of music hall songs because that's what she really liked. She wanted a bit of fun. So I always associated this music with safety and comfort and love. And it always sounded just right to me. And so that when I, got a bit older, we learned songs at school. We learned songs from Henry Purcell, and we also sang some folk songs that Cecil Sharp had collected in England around the turn of the last century, but then bowdlerized really to make them suitable for children to sing. So, I mean, I had and hymns at school. We used to meet every morning in the great hall at school. That was when I was at grammar school, when I was 11 on, and there would always be a couple of hymns to sing every morning, and I loved them, because they were associated with good old English tunes as well. And although I'm not a religious person, I just loved the sound of those hymns and singing them. And
Yes.
I also think it was a great way to get the whole lot of girls together. It was a unifying thing, and I always loved it. And sorry, am I getting over? I'm getting overexcited here.
No, please
I
keep
knew I
going.
wanted to be a folk singer, though, due to an American movie. Yep.
Wait, which one?
My sister and I used to go to, this was after the war, when we were sort of 14, 15 years old. We'd go down into Hastings. Mum would give us 10 shillings, and you could go to the cinema for that and have a lunch and go to the library as well, which is what we did every Saturday. And in those days, they showed 2 films, and each program, an A movie and a B movie. And one day we saw a B movie that was called Nightclub Girl. And this was a story of a girl in the Tennessee mountains who, quite by chance and because of an airplane crash, was heard singing her folk songs by a New York nightclub owner. And he persuaded her to go back to New York with him. And she sang her songs in nightclubs and wore very pretty frocks, and fell in love with somebody or other. And I thought, well, I want to do that. I'm going to be a folk singer. So I actually wrote to the BBC and told them. And by complete chance, this letter was passed on to a man called Bob Popper from Sussex, who came from a family whose tradition of song went back some 400 years. And he was at that time working for the BBC, collecting folk songs in Sussex and Hampshire, just on the south coast here where I am. And he was a hero of mine. I'd heard a lot of his programs on the radio, and they passed this letter to Bob. And he turned up on our front doorstep one day when he was in Hastings recording songs from the Fishermen. And it was complete chance, wasn't it? And that started a long friendship with Bob. I mean, I've been neighbours with him for a long time and such good friends, and I'm such admirer of his. And if that hadn't happened, if I hadn't seen that film and written a letter to the BBC, and if somebody hadn't been kind enough not to throw it in the waste paper basket, but to hand it to Bob, things might have been totally different.
Well, I mean, how do you think you might have turned out? Because I'm curious about these kinds of things. When I talk to people on the show, usually there are a lot of redundancies in terms of like, well, this thing happened, but if you hadn't written that letter, if they hadn't given it to Bob, then something else might have happened to put you on this path. But also in saying this and telling me this story, I also see other parts of your life kind of in embryo in this story, right? Talking to becoming friends with, being encouraged by this archivist, then kind of preps you also for becoming friends with Alan Lomax in a certain sense.
Well, yes, that's true. I had a point. I was trying to think. What was I trying to think? Oh, yes. I mean, had Bob not turned up on the door, I may have become a school teacher, because that was what my headmistress thought I should do. But it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I tried it for a year. I went to Teachers Training College for a year, but gave it up because it wasn't what I wanted to do. Because also my sister and I were singing occasionally at social gatherings at a hotel in Oak, in Hastings, where members of the local Labour Party used to meet. And it was there that, so we were singing some folk songs and some songs that Dolly was writing. And there I met a man called John Hasted, who told me about the English Folk Dance and Song Society and Cecil Sharp House and the library there, where there were a great many books of folk song. And this sort of stayed in my mind. That was always a sort of mecca for me. It was where I really wanted to go and see what was there and what I could find. So after I spent a year at training college, I left and I came home to Hastings, and I took a job as a bus conductress for a year to save up enough money to go off to London to live for a bit. And the extraordinary thing though is, once I got to Cecil Sharp House and asked if I could go to the library, they wouldn't let me in. It was a very, it was such a suspicious place at that time. They just didn't. And outside the door, there's a great stone with the words carved on it, to the memory of Cecil Sharp, who gave the people of England their music back, something like that. And I thought, well, I'm a people of England, you know, you can let me in, surely. But it was a struggle. I finally, you know, so persistent that they did let me in, and I did search through all the books and started noting down, you know, if I loved a verse or the words, I would just copy them down. And I couldn't read music, and I still can't. And I used to just note down all the songs on manuscript paper, take them home to Hastings and get Dolly to play them on the piano. And if I liked the tunes, then I learned the song.
Wait, why wouldn't they let you in the library?
It was a very middle class, upper class place then, run by toffs, you know, really wealthy people. And although this music came from the working classes and the labouring classes, they just didn't want anybody of that class inside. I mean, at one point, the president of the English Folk Dance and Song Society was Princess Margaret. You know, what sort of sense does that make?
I mean, if the 20th into the 21st century could be distilled into one single thing, it is a folk society that run by the posh that refuses to let anyone from the working class in to look at the songs.
Yep. Well, that was it. It changed over the years, of course.
I mean, was that a shock for you too? You know, coming from a working class background to go to London or to enter into a kind of more middle class to upper middle class world?
I was yes, I always felt yeah, I was aware of class, you know, in those days, especially in the 50s. The class system in England was sort of, you know, rife. You knew if you were working class, you know, you were sort of kept down. Yeah, it was just class ridden. But and obviously, as you get older and braver, you can overcome that. And I knew that I was so intensely in love with this music by now, because I was also finally able to, when I met the right people, like Peter Kennedy at the house, he actually let me listen to some of the field recordings that he'd made. And you know, to listen to these old people singing, it was like listening to my granddad sing for a start. You know, it was as familiar to me as that. But the songs they sang, you know, there's so many hundreds of songs. And Cecil Sharp himself collected over 2,000 songs in the first few months when he decided to go out noting down songs all those years ago. Because people were still singing, you know, England was still, although there was a big industrial part of the country, in the south it was still agrarian, you know, people were still so-called peasants. Some of them were actually called peasants. So that there were so many people were still singing all these songs in the countryside, you know, farm labourers and their wives, the carters, the gamekeepers, the poachers. These songs are being sung. And thank goodness, the BBC had the wit to send Bob Copper and Peter Kennedy out in the field in the mid-1950s to record what was left. And I think they got it just in time.
I mean, I'm trying to put this together in my head, but like, there is something interesting, I think, in folk music going from a vibrant living part of people's lives to it being a kind of like an archival project as the 20th century changed. I don't have an actual question. I'm curious about kind of like how you saw it change, like how you saw culture change as kind of the 20th century goes on, into the 50s and so on.
No, there were some very clear points. There was one book of Herefordshire folk songs, for instance, that was written in the 1910s, as far back as that. And the person who wrote the foreword described this music being squashed or, just completely overrun by what he called the steamroller of modern music. And that was as far back as 1910. And of course, with the arrival of pop music and its popularity, and the fact that, half the population had left the countryside here and moved up north to work in the mills, they were still sort of finding themselves in dreadful situations of poverty and crowding and whatnot. But they turned away from this music of the countryside, and it was no longer relevant to them. And in many ways, I don't know how you can describe music as irrelevant, though, because you could say that anything, say, from Monteverdi is irrelevant because that was written 500 or more years ago. It doesn't count anymore. But the one great shift that I found, Andy, and this is when I was in the States, and Alan and I went to see Rock Around the Clock. What was the film? Blackboard Jungle. That was showing in the 1950s. And we saw it, and Rock Around the Clock was played all through it with Bill Haley and the Comets. And it was the story of, this awful, disgraceful bad behavior in schools. And as I watched it, I thought, this is a turning point. Even as a 24-year-old, I sat there thinking, this is different. This is a turning point. Things aren't going to be nice after this. And it was a sort of prescience, I think, about how music just sort of overwhelmed everything and overwhelmed. There's just so much anger and roughness and violence, and I just felt that it was a bad thing. It might not have, it had to happen in many ways, but it just seemed so sudden and so violent. And I was always aware of that, remembering that feeling in that cinema, that this was the start of something that I wasn't going to like.
Yeah, there is, I can only witness it from my vantage point, but it seems like the minute, the minute business became, got its hooks in the art world, I don't know if that happened, like at what point that happened, is it the 50s? You noticed it when you saw this movie, but it started to get, well, I don't know. Let me ask you, how do you think it changed?
Well, you're right. You used the word business. It became a music industry, didn't it?
Yeah.
There was money to be made and people wanted to make money.
It's interesting because I'm seeing it now. For the first 10 years of podcasting, anyone could make a podcast, and anyone could become known for their podcast. And about 2 years ago, business people with money started to take notice.
Yes.
And you could feel the shift. You could feel the shift go from people who are, there's still people who are passionate like me, like this is something I've never monetized this. I've tried to keep this as pure as possible. But like you could tell it went from something in general, something that people were passionate about to something people could make money off of. And it changed. You could feel the change. I can't say anything more than that. In that, like, if you are sensitive, you could feel it shift.
Yes.
And I assume you could feel that, in the 50s or so.
Well, I did. I mean, as I say, that was quite a moment, an illuminating moment in that cinema. But after I got back to England, but that would be 1960, then skiffle music was really popular in England. I don't know if it wasn't so big in the States, was it? But somebody has said that it was, the first sort of working class music post-war, because you could play a washboard, you could just make your own double bass out of a cardboard box and a bit of string, and you could thrash a guitar and sing songs that came mostly from southern prisons, the American southern prisons, but that the singer, what was his name, Lonnie Donegan, had claimed he'd written a lot of Leadbelly songs, and these songs were just thrashed out for a couple of years, and it was just dreadful. Original songs had been great, sung by Leadbelly, but not by Lonnie Donegan, and certainly not by all the people who wanted to get into the skiffle movement. And that sort of, I don't know, it was like the end of a avalanche or something of this music, and then it all sort of piled down the bottom of the mountain, and things then had to start up again. But there was so much violence in music as well. The people that, I don't know, spitting on stage and throwing things and smashing guitars. What was that all about? Just to entertain the mobs?
Huh. Yeah, I don't know. Part of it is spectacle, right? You start to get into this era where, in some way, part of the performance is creating a spectacle. You have some people who it is a genuine emotional expression in some way, where maybe they can't get those emotions out somewhere else. But also you have some of it where it's like very insincere. And, I've seen people like this, maybe not necessarily in music, but definitely in entertainment, where they know what will get attention. And so they've created a persona that is a certain way on stage, and it gets attention.
Well, people love it as well, don't they? I mean, when you think of how the audiences flock to people, to things like that, it baffles me. But that's how it is. It's being abused in many ways, I think, and I also think it's taken advantage of an audience too. I think in a way it's sort of treating them with contempt.
Oh, interesting. And well, I mean, in what way do you see that?
Well, you can throw virtually anything at the audience and they will lap it up. That you don't have to sort of modify anything. You can just get more and more gross. That's how I see it. But of course, other people see it as really, wonderfully entertaining. But I don't.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That there's a certain sense in which it's like, think about your audience as a bunch of dopes who like throwing red meat to them, and like thinking like, oh, these idiots will lap it up, as opposed to treating them like intelligent consumers of art.
Listen, it's more like a spectacle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like throwing the gladiators to the lions, I think.
I mean, but there's also a certain...
Sorry, go on.
No, there's a certain sense where, folk music, you have these associations of safety with folk music.
Well, yes, but A lot of the songs aren't concerned with safety, are they? A lot of, this is what I find remarkable about this music is that it can sing about anything. It can talk to you about anything, from death, murder, harvest time, Christmas. It will sing about everything. And because you're singing it, you're just presenting it as a story. You're not endorsing this story. For instance, if there's a murder ballad you're singing, you're not endorsing it, but you're just passing it on and showing it to people. I find it fascinating that there's virtually no subject that a folk song won't sing about, but it doesn't sort of ram it down your throat. You're allowed to listen to it and make up your own mind about, your feelings about it. I know that a great many of my songs deal with, I'm such a cheerful person, really, but a great many of these songs, are about the harsh things in life as well as the beautiful things in life. And I've always found that absolutely a compelling part of it, that you can sing these wonderful old songs in beautiful language and often with, the most gorgeous tunes as well. And there's nothing they won't touch. They don't flinch at anything, but they don't ram it down your throat. You're the person that's listening and you're the person that can make up your mind what you think about it. It's not being flung at you all dressed up in smoke and mirrors and things. You just left, and that's how I present it anyway. I get the loveliest accompaniments I can. I get the best arrangers, who are always friends anyway, so that the songs are presented properly, but they're not sort of over embroidered or overdone or hurled at you. They're just presented as songs. Just listen to this one. What do you think of this one? Listen to this.
Well, in some way, then it's like a collaborative enterprise. I don't know what word to use, but let's say enterprise, a collaborative enterprise between you and the audience in a way that, and I'm thinking about like the kind of, especially when you were growing up into the 40s and the 50s, there's an association of folk music with left politics.
Yes, except, my family were very left-wing. My mum was a socialist for sure. And so I grew up with that as a background. But what I didn't ever like, folk song to me was the genuine thing. There are enough songs in the tradition that talk about the harshness of life, the difficulties that people have, and how badly they're treated. What I didn't like was folk music being sort of appropriated for this, for the protest songs. It didn't sit well with me. I didn't want it used in that way. And I felt there was quite a lot of insincerity as well. People who were singing protest songs, awfully well off and nicely sung and everything, but what experience had they got really? And so I disassociated myself from those movements because I was interested in the folk song. And of course I've got my ideas about politics and things that are going wrong in the world and how dreadful a lot of our leaders are. But that was different from the song. And I didn't want it mixed up with that.
So there's something about I'll say this and you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong, but for you, this kind of like or let me just ask this. Do you see yourself as having this kind of like historical continuity with this history of folk, with these songs that go back hundreds, if not more years?
Well, yes, I do. That's part of the fascination of it for me. And some of the things I say about it, I know sound a bit twee, but what I've always felt, because I've always talked, when I do this, when I sing a song, I always say where it came from, who I got it from, because they were often people, the farm workers who were despised and downtrodden and, exploited most of their lives. I didn't want to exploit them any further by just taking their songs and not acknowledging that they were the person that last sang it. So I always made a point of mentioning the name of the person I got the song from, and some of their history as well. So I've lost my track. What did you ask me? Oh, the historical.
Yeah.
The historical. Yeah, sorry, the historical aspect of it. And the more you think about that, the further and further and further it goes back, because then you are interested in the person that person learnt it from, and the person before that. And some of the songs, do go back hundreds of years, and some of them just go back to the times of the Napoleonic Wars, for instance. But it's always important to me to mention the person who sang it, because they've got to have some sort of recognition for this wonderful music they've passed on to us. Although they didn't know they were doing it, it just was part of their lives that they sang. But they did sing, and they sang these songs, and I think you have to honor them for that.
I mean, in some way, then that's like a very sincere left politics, right? Because you want to make sure, especially these working class people, have gotten the recognition for these songs, and that there is this, and you feel like, again, tell me if this is correct or not, but that there is some kind of, you feel like there is this continuity between you and these people, and that you are making sure that these working class songs and their feelings are getting the recognition that they were due.
That's absolutely right. And I think it's the proper thing to do as well. Otherwise, you're another person who's exploiting them, exploiting their memory. And I don't want to do that. And my own background was rural and labouring class. My grandparents, and the family behind them. So it was always important. It's just the crucial thing to me to remember those singers.
Yeah, and so to me, like when I talk about like left politics, I'm like, that to me is true, sincere left politics, as opposed to whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I've always, as I say, been left wing myself, but I didn't ever want to sing about it in the way that people like Pete Seeger did, exhorting audiences to join the chorus. And I just thought, I don't want to work people up to that sort of pitch, I mean, I know what I think, thanks. You don't need to tell me. But then perhaps some people do need to be told, and do need to sort of join in the throng. But it wasn't for me. I just had to do it my way.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so another thing I'm curious about, coming from a working class background, and maybe it was a little different in the 40s and 50s, but now coming from a working class background, it's very difficult to get into the arts, or at least to make art for a living. And I'm curious, besides the fact that you had this kind of maybe encouragement from the BBC, right? What gave you the confidence to like leave teaching college? You said you did a year of teaching college. Like what gave you the confidence to leave that and want to, go to London and want to look at old folk songs and try to pursue this?
Just because I loved them so much. It was an absolute passion of mine. I can't describe it any other way. I had to do it. It was the only thing I was really interested in. And I don't know, I'm just born to it, I think. I was born in the right class to the right parents and grandparents, and I just knew it was what I wanted to do, and it was what I had to do. So I did it.
I mean, did you see that passion in other people in your life? Did you witness any kind of like, a compulsion to, an overpowering feeling in other people when you were growing up?
When I was growing up, well, I mean, as I say, I suppose Uncle Fred was the main example to me of how whatever you were doing, you could overcome it and do what you really wanted to do, even if you had to still do like he did, reading meters in people's houses. He knew he could write, and he wanted to write, and so he wrote, and he did these other things as well. But I think with his example and his enthusiasm for everything, and his love of life as well, and the sort of laughter, he was such a funny man. I think I sort of imbibed a lot of that from him, that you can do things, you can do it, even if you have to struggle at the same time. And I'm just besotted with this music, and I hadn't even heard enough of it then. I didn't know what treasures there were waiting for me, but I just knew that I had to go and try and find out. So it's not a very good answer, but it's
no, it's a great answer. It's also there's we're just chatting. There's no good or bad answers really, right? I'm just curious about especially growing up in Hastings. I mean, what kind of was it? A large town? Like how big of a area was it? How many people were there?
It's not a big town. It's a seaside town, and the old part of the town is the fishing end. That was what Hastings was, a fishing village at first, and it grew into a fishing town. Although William the Conqueror built his big castle there, and then the town sort of grew, spread a bit. The modern part of town isn't very pretty at all. It's not a big town, but it's a very poor town. There's still difficulties with finding jobs and employment and things there. And it was always a Tory town right up until fairly recently, when they had their first Labour member of Parliament. So in many ways it was sort of backward town as well. It's an interesting place to grow up in many ways, but also hidebound as well. They didn't sort of look out much. They only looked out to sea, really.
But I mean, they're also like, I think specifically about Europe, England, especially growing up on the seaside. It has to be, and I'm putting words into your mouth, and again, please tell me how accurate they are. But like, I have to imagine that it is the natural beauty of the area is something is a gives you that feeling inside that I don't know about inspiration. What I'm calling inspiration, that feeling in your chest, or at least in my chest, when I see that kind of stuff. When I go visit it, I'm in Los Angeles and it's disgusting looking and it's not very inspiring. But I imagine growing up in a place like this does give you that feeling all the time.
Well, it does. I have to say it does. And I mean, the whole of Sussex itself is very beautiful. And I'm really proud that I am a Sussex-born person, that I still live here. My sister and I spent so much of our childhood out in the countryside as well. Mum would, take us out sometimes when during the war, when the bombing raids were on. You'd get out in the country and you'd feel safer. Because in town, my sister and I were actually strafed by a German bomber one day when we were quite young children. We were walking down. By that time, we'd been bombed out of one of our houses. An incendiary bomb had hit the house next door, and ours had gone up with it. So we had to move up to Aunt Grace's house at the top end of Hastings. And you could look right down from her road straight down to the sea eventually. And one day, Dolly and I were walking down the road, and we saw this black plane coming up from the sea. And by that time, we'd learned to tell which were German planes and which were English planes, theirs or ours. And we dived into the hedge because it was such a black plane. And as we lay there, the pilot just strafed machine gun fire right in front along the road in front of us, zipped up all the surface. It was quite an experience. But sorry, I digress though. Yes, so this, I mean, the whole area, you see, I just love old things. I mean, I loved my old grandparents, not that they were that old, but they were old enough. They were old to me. I loved old people. And I always have patience with old people as well, which, you know, a great many young people don't have. But I think it's just my grandparents are crucial. You know, I've realised that throughout my life, that had I not had those grandparents, I wouldn't be the person I am, or have loved the stuff that I love. But you know, we would go out to walks in the country, and if you walk in the country in Sussex, you just come across churches, um, because there were so many. You know, each hamlet almost had a church. So there were Saxon churches, and then there were Norman churches, and then the later ones. But I always loved those old small churches, just to go into them and feel that the damp and the cold and the atmosphere of all those hundreds of people who've been there in there before me. Um, so, yeah, I mean, I just love England, but I don't love England as it is now.
Hmm.
I love, I love the thought of the past in many ways. Although you can't love it when you really know about any country's past, can you? You know, you've got to be ashamed of many of the things that the countries did in your name. Um, and yet I love England, even if I'm not sure I love the English at the moment, because we seem to vote for such impossible leaders.
Mm.
Not that I did, but
Well, you love the spirit of what it stands for, and also like what it possibly could be.
what it possibly could be. Well, there used to be a time when I thought the word honourable meant something.
Yeah, but I mean, like in some way, like the best symbols of both our countries are worth believing in, even if the our countries themselves, especially America, does not live up to that image.
Mm. Well, that's certainly true. And of course, I mean, I'm really proud of, apart from the music of England, you know, the folk music of England. Of course, we've got Shakespeare and we've got Charles Dickens, and we've got great writers nowadays too. And so there is that, and Henry Fielding. You know, people who could write about things as they really were, but in the most entertaining way. And so there's that side of it as well. But when I look at things today, I mean, yes, we've still got some great playwrights and some great authors, but we've just got so much banal stuff, you know, that it's so appalling, and yet people lap it up and love it. And it's the people on television that are the heroes, you know, for a great many of the members of the population. And you think, why? You know, why do you love that person? How can you bear to listen to this person? You know, why do you want to watch some half-dressed woman flashing her great long talons at you? You know, and you applaud it and think it's wonderful. I mean, that might be because I'm in my 80s now, you know, so I wouldn't find that interesting anyway.
I think it goes back to distraction. I think there is a great many people who don't want to have to engage with the world the way it is. And so they seek out as much distraction as possible.
But why does it have to be such tacky distraction?
That's true. That's true. I guess they could seek out distraction that was fulfilling. um, we're right at the end, and I just want to kind of go back to one thing because I'm curious. You know, you said that. Well, first, let me ask this. You know, you mentioned that you were strafed by a German like Luftwaffe plane. What happened right after that? Because to me, that seems like such a traumatic incident.
I mean, we were used to bombing raids in Hastings, which is partly why, you know, we were evacuated, but then we were sent home again. There used to be bombing raids in Hastings. The beach was barricaded. You couldn't go down to the beach in case, because of invasion, threats of invasion. Um, so what did you say? What did you say?
Oh, it seemed like it was such a traumatic incident.
Well, traumatic. Yeah. Well, it was, but we were bombed out of one house, remember, and we used to sleep at night, partly sometimes in Granny and Grandad's shelter. Sometimes we slept up at Aunt Grace's in the cupboard under the stairs, try and keep safe from bombing raids. And a bomb hit a house over the road from Aunt Grace's, and all the plaster on her ceiling came down on us as we lay there. You're just used to this sort of stuff, really. It happened, and you bore it. You had to, because what else could you do? And it was war.
In some way, it's very interesting to me that you're becoming conscious as a person while the world is kind of falling apart in some way.
Well, I suppose, yeah. But I mean, perhaps that was what led me into loving this music so much, because I knew that it had lasted longer than anything that could happen now would last. I wonder if that's true. I've only just thought of that. I would tell you that when I was a schoolgirl, my favourite period in history was the Tudor, the Queen Elizabeth I period. And I always thought I'd long to go back to live in Elizabethan England. It was one thing I used to fantasise about. But later learned, of course, that not everybody looked like Errol Flynn. So it was all a myth, really. But no, so I thank goodness I was, I came through the war safely and was able to sort of, go back and go forward as well.
Yeah. I mean, what was that like for you? Like, after the end of the war, where do you go? Do you rebuild your house? Like, what happens then in this kind of, how do you get back to a sense of normalcy?
Well, we moved into a house that Mum rented 2 doors away from Granny and Grandad. Dad came back from the army, but my parents just couldn't make it together. Mum had been used to, being independent while Dad was away for 5 years, and they divorced really soon after, which was the most dreadful thing for me. Just to miss my dad and then to see him in the street round the corner with his new family. He'd married a widow who had 2 grown-up children, and we used to see them walking out, and that was my dad. So I'd lost my dad, which was terrible. I only saw him once when I was in my 30s. He came to a concert that Dolly and I were giving in the town where he lived, and again, that was the last time I saw him, just that once. So all these experiences, you just have to bear them, really, and hopefully benefit from them rather than letting them hurt you too much.
Yeah.
But yeah. That's tough. You can say it, but you can't always do it.
Yeah. I mean, you're an incredibly strong person. I probably because of some of these things.
Well, yes, and the lovely thing about it, I realise at this ultimate end of my life, is that music still consoles me as well as thrills me, and it just consoles me. Yes.
Shirley, I can't thank you enough for talking with me.
Well, Andy, I've really enjoyed it. I wish we could go on.
This was just a delight. I'm an absolute fan, so I'm really glad we could talk.
Well, if you ever make it over to England again.
Yes, if the pandemic ever ends.
if the world ever opens up again.
But thank you so much again.
Thank you for wanting to talk. That's really nice.
Yeah.
Goodbye then.
All right. Have a great day. Or great night, I guess.
What time is it there?
It is 11 a.m.
Oh, right. So it's 7 p.m. here.
Mm-hmm. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.